Close your eyes and imagine this for a moment. Right now, as you lie here listening to my voice, you are being pulled, not by a person, not by a rope, not by anything you can see or touch, but pulled nonetheless. The earth beneath you is reaching up through the mattress, through the sheets, through your skin, wrapping invisible fingers around every atom in your body and holding you here, holding you close. And here's what makes me pause every single time I think about it. This pull, this embrace, it isn't just happening to you. It's happening to the moon, 238,000 miles away. It's happening to the sun, 93 million miles distant. It's happening between galaxies so far apart that their light takes billions of years to cross the void between them. The same force that's tucking you into bed right now is conducting a symphony across the entire universe. And we call it gravity. But what is it, really? I want to take you on a journey tonight. A journey from A to Z, through one of the most intimate, most mysterious, most absolutely fundamental forces that has ever existed. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you're going to understand not just what gravity is, but why it matters, why it's been the invisible author of your entire life story, why every step you've ever taken, every breath you've ever drawn, every tear that's ever rolled down your cheek, happened because gravity was there, quietly working in the background. But here's what I need you to know right now. This isn't going to be a lecture. This isn't going to be me drowning you in equations or jargon or the kind of science that made you zone out in school. This is going to be different. Because gravity isn't just physics. It's poetry. It's the universe's way of saying that everything, absolutely everything, is connected. That nothing exists alone. That to simply be, to have mass, to take up space in this cosmos, is to reach out and touch everything else, forever. So get comfortable. Let your body sink into whatever's holding you. Feel that pull. That's gravity. That's home. That's where we begin. We're going to start at the very beginning, with the letter A. And A stands for attraction, because that's what gravity is. At its heart, it's attraction. Pure, universal, unavoidable attraction. Every single piece of matter in the universe is attracted to every other piece of matter. You're attracted to the earth. The earth is attracted to you. You're attracted to the person sleeping in the next room. Your coffee mug this morning was attracted to the moon. The moon is attracted to Saturn. Saturn is attracted to a grain of sand on a beach in Thailand. Everything pulls on everything else. Always, without exception, without pause, without ever getting tired. And I find that so beautiful it almost hurts, because it means that in the deepest, most literal, most scientifically verifiable way, we are all connected. You have never been separate from anything. Not really. Right now, you are in a gravitational relationship with the Andromeda galaxy. It's 2.5 million light years away, but you're pulling on it, and it's pulling on you. The pull is unimaginably tiny, so small we could never measure it, but it's there. It's real. You and Andromeda are in this together. Now, I know what you might be thinking. If everything is pulling on everything else, why don't we just all collapse into one giant cosmic blob? Why is there any distance between anything at all? And that's where things get interesting, because gravity's attraction follows rules. Beautiful, elegant, mathematical rules that we're going to explore tonight. But before we dive into the math, which I promise will be gentle, I want you to understand something crucial. Gravity is weak. Surprisingly, almost comically weak. It's the weakest of all the fundamental forces in the universe. Electromagnetism is stronger. The strong nuclear force that holds atoms together is vastly stronger. Even the weak nuclear force, which has weak right there in its name, is stronger than gravity. You can prove gravity's weakness right now. Well, not right now because you're lying down, but imagine this. A refrigerator magnet can hold a piece of paper to a fridge. That tiny magnet is overcoming the gravitational pull of the entire Earth. The whole planet is pulling down on that paper, and a magnet the size of your thumb says, "No thanks, I've got this." That's how weak gravity is. But here's the twist. Here's what makes gravity the most important force in the universe despite being the weakest. Gravity never gives up. It never cancels out. It never says, "Okay, I'm done now." Electromagnetism can be neutralized. Positive and negative charges can balance each other. But gravity just keeps adding up. More mass means more gravity. Always. Forever. Without limit. So yes, gravity is weak, but it's patient. And over cosmic scales, across billions of years, with enough mass, gravity becomes the force that shapes everything. Galaxies, stars, planets, you. Before humans understood gravity, we still felt it. Of course we did. We felt it every time we fell. Every time we dropped something. Every time we tried to jump and came back down. Our ancestors knew that things fall. They knew that what goes up must come down. They knew that the sky was up and the ground was down. But they didn't know why. They didn't understand that fall was actually a kind of embrace, that the earth wasn't indifferent to them. It was reaching out, constantly, pulling them close, keeping them safe. For most of human history, we explained this with stories, gods, spirits, the natural order of things. Aristotle thought that objects had a natural place they wanted to return to. Stones wanted to be with the earth, so they fell down. Fire wanted to be with the heavens, so it rose up, everything seeking its home. And there's something lovely about that, isn't there? Even though it's wrong scientifically, there's a poetry to the idea that things fall because they're homesick, because they're trying to return to where they belong. But the truth, when we finally found it, turned out to be even more poetic, even more profound, because the truth is that things don't fall because they want to. They fall because space itself is curved. They fall because mass tells space how to bend, and space tells mass how to move. They fall because the universe is not a stage where things happen, but an active participant in every interaction. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll come back to that, but I wanted you to see the arc of this journey, from not knowing to knowing, from mystery to understanding, and how understanding doesn't kill the wonder, it deepens it. So let's talk about B. B is for bend, because that's what gravity does. It bends. It bends the path of planets around the sun. It bends the path of light around massive objects. And according to Einstein, it bends space itself. But we'll start simpler than Einstein. We'll start with the way a thrown ball bends through the air. When you throw a ball horizontally, it doesn't go straight. It curves. It arcs. It falls even as it moves forward. You've seen this a million times. Maybe you've thrown a million balls. But have you ever really stopped to think about what's happening? The ball wants to go straight. Newton's first law says an object in motion stays in motion in a straight line unless acted upon by an external force. The ball has momentum. It has direction. But gravity is constantly pulling it down. Not stopping it from moving forward, but adding a downward component to its motion. Every fraction of every second, gravity is saying, "Come down, come down, come down," and the ball compromises. It keeps moving forward, but it also moves down. The result is a curve, a parabola, if you want to be technical. But really, it's a negotiation. A dance between the ball's desire to keep going and the Earth's desire to pull it close. Now imagine throwing that ball faster. The curve gets flatter. The ball goes farther before hitting the ground. Throw it faster still. Even farther. Now imagine, and this is where it gets wild, imagine throwing the ball so fast that the curve of its fall matches the curve of the Earth. The ball is falling, constantly falling, but the Earth is curving away beneath it at the same rate, so the ball never gets any closer to the ground. It just keeps falling around the Earth, forever. Congratulations, you've just invented orbit. That's all an orbit is. Falling sideways fast enough that you keep missing the ground. The moon isn't floating up there. It's falling. Right now. It's been falling for 4.5 billion years. It's just really, really good at missing. C is for curve. And we've already started talking about it. But I want to go deeper, because curves are everywhere in gravity. Planetary orbits are curves. The path of light near a massive object is a curve. Space-time itself, in Einstein's vision, is curved. And there's something about curves that feels more true to life than straight lines, doesn't it? Life doesn't move in straight lines. Love doesn't. Growth doesn't. We curve. We arc. We spiral. We orbit around the things that matter to us. And maybe that's not just a metaphor. Maybe that's gravity, showing us something fundamental about the nature of reality. That connection, that attraction, that pull toward others, it inherently creates curves. It inherently creates orbits. Think about the shape of the Earth's orbit around the Sun. It's not a perfect circle. It's an ellipse, a stretched circle. At some times of year, we're closer to the Sun. At others, farther away. The orbit is a curve that breathes, and every planet has its own curve, its own ellipse, its own rhythm. Mercury whips around in just 88 days, its orbit small and tight. Neptune takes 165 Earth years to complete one lazy loop, each planet dancing its own dance, all because of gravity's invisible choreography. But here's something that blew my mind when I first learned it. The curves aren't just in space, they're in time too. When you're closer to a massive object, time itself moves slower for you. This isn't science fiction. This is measured, confirmed, proven reality. Astronauts in orbit age slightly slower than people on Earth. Not much. Fractions of a second over their whole mission. But it's real. GPS satellites have to account for this, or they'd give you wrong directions. They're farther from Earth's mass, so time runs slightly faster for them. Gravity curves time. Being in a gravitational field is like being in a valley in time, where every second stretches just a little bit longer, and the stronger the gravity, the deeper the valley, the slower time flows. D is for drop, and dropping is the purest, simplest expression of gravity. Let go of something, and it drops. It accelerates downward at 9.8 meters per second squared, if you're on Earth. That number, 9.8, it's been burned into the brain of every physics student. But what does it mean? It means that every second you're falling, you're moving 9.8 meters per second faster than you were the second before. Drop something from rest, and after 1 second, it's moving at 9.8 meters per second. After 2 seconds, 19.6 meters per second. After 3 seconds, 29.4, and so on. Building speed, building momentum, accelerating. And here's what's extraordinary. It doesn't matter what you drop. A feather and a hammer, in the absence of air resistance, fall at exactly the same rate. The hammer is heavier. Yes, it has more mass. So gravity pulls on it harder, but it also has more inertia, more resistance to being accelerated, and these two effects exactly cancel out. More pull, more resistance, same acceleration. This is why astronauts on the moon could drop a feather and a hammer and watch them hit the ground at the same time. No air to get in the way, just pure gravity, and they fell together. There's something deeply egalitarian about this. Gravity doesn't play favorites. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, heavy or light, important or invisible. Gravity pulls on all of us with the same acceleration. We are all equal in the eyes of gravity. E is for Einstein. We can't talk about gravity without talking about Albert Einstein, the man who changed everything we thought we knew about it. Before Einstein, we had Newton's gravity. And Newton's gravity worked beautifully. It explained the planets, the tides, falling apples, everything. Newton said gravity is a force that acts at a distance. Masses attract each other across empty space. How? Nobody knew. It just did. And that bothered some people, actually. It bothered Newton himself. How can the sun reach across 93 million miles of nothing and pull on the Earth? What's the mechanism? Newton basically shrugged and said, I don't know, but here's the math that describes it. And the math works. And it did work. For 200 years, Newton's law of universal gravitation was one of the triumphs of human thought. But there were tiny problems, little cracks. The orbit of Mercury didn't quite match Newton's predictions. It wobbled slightly, a mere 43 arcseconds per century off from where it should be. You might think, that's nothing, a rounding error. But when you're describing the motion of the heavens with perfect precision, even a whisper of deviation is a scream. Astronomers noticed it. They measured it again and again, hoping the discrepancy would vanish. It didn't. Some proposed there was another planet, closer to the sun than Mercury, tugging it off course. They called this phantom world Vulcan and spent decades searching for it. They never found it, because it didn't exist. The cracks kept appearing. Light behaved strangely around massive objects. Time seemed to pass differently, depending on where you were and how fast you moved. These weren't huge, glaring failures. They were subtle. The kind of thing you could ignore if you wanted to. The kind of thing that makes you uncomfortable, because you know, deep down, something fundamental is wrong. And this is where we meet one of the most remarkable minds in human history. Einstein didn't set out to destroy Newton's universe. He loved physics, loved the elegance of it, but he was also willing to ask uncomfortable questions. What if light always moves at the same speed, no matter how fast you're traveling? What if space and time aren't separate things, but woven together? What if gravity isn't a force pulling objects together, but the curvature of space-time itself? These weren't small tweaks. These were revolutionary ideas that turned physics inside out. And when Einstein worked through the mathematics of general relativity, something beautiful happened. Mercury's orbit made perfect sense. The anomaly vanished. Not because Einstein fudged the numbers, but because his equations naturally, elegantly described what was actually happening. And this is where general relativity becomes almost heartbreaking in its beauty. Because Einstein didn't just solve one problem. He didn't just patch a leak. He rewrote the entire foundation of physics in a way that made dozens of impossible things suddenly, inevitably true. Think about light for a moment. Newton would tell you light travels in straight lines. Always. It has no mass, so gravity can't touch it. But Einstein's equations whispered something different. If gravity isn't a force but a curvature of space-time itself, then light doesn't have a choice. It follows the curved geography of the universe. A beam of light passing near the sun wouldn't travel straight. It would bend. This was testable, radical, dangerous even, because if Einstein was wrong, his entire theory collapsed. In 1919, during a solar eclipse, astronomer Arthur Eddington travelled to the island of Principe off the coast of Africa. The eclipse would briefly reveal stars near the sun, stars that should appear in one position if Newton was right, and a slightly different position if Einstein was right. The difference was tiny. A fraction of a degree, but it was everything. Eddington took his photographs, developed them with shaking hands, probably, and measured. The starlight had bent, exactly as Einstein predicted. Not close, not approximately, exactly. When the results were announced, it made front-page news worldwide. Einstein became an overnight celebrity, the man who proved that the universe itself could bend. But here's what gets me. Einstein published General Relativity in 1915, 4 years before Eddington's expedition, 4 years before anyone confirmed he was right. He just knew. He worked from pure mathematics, pure intuition, pure faith that beauty and truth were somehow the same thing. And the implications kept cascading. If space-time can curve, it can also ripple, gravitational waves, disturbances in the fabric of reality itself, traveling at the speed of light. Einstein predicted these in 1916. We didn't detect them until 2015, 100 years later, but they were there all along, exactly as his equations promised, washing through the cosmos every time massive objects collide billions of light years away. And here's what makes that century-long wait so profound. Einstein didn't have billion-dollar detectors. He didn't have supercomputers. He had paper, pencils, and this almost supernatural ability to imagine his way into the fabric of reality. He literally thought his way to the edge of space and time, and he was right. Think about sitting in your study in 1916, wars raging across Europe, writing equations that describe something so subtle that detecting it would require measuring distances smaller than a proton across instruments stretching miles, and being correct, not approximately correct, precisely, mathematically, beautifully correct. When LIGO finally detected those gravitational waves, the scientists checking the data thought it might be a test. Someone must have injected a fake signal, because the waveform they detected matched Einstein's century-old predictions so perfectly that it seemed impossible. Reality itself was speaking in Einstein's mathematical language. That's the terrifying beauty of deep thinking. You can be so right that people won't believe you for 100 years. But Einstein's journey to these heights of understanding didn't start with genius. It started with failure. Spectacular, public, humiliating failure that would have destroyed most people's confidence forever. He couldn't speak fluently until he was almost 4 years old, not because of any medical condition, but because he preferred thinking to talking. Teachers called him slow, difficult, hopelessly behind his peers. His elementary school years were marked by clashes with authority. He hated rote memorization, the mechanical recitation of facts without understanding. While other students dutifully repeated what teachers told them, young Einstein would ask why until his instructors ran out of patience. One teacher told him directly that he would never amount to anything. At 16, he failed his entrance exam to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic. Failed. The man who would revolutionize physics couldn't pass a standard admissions test. He had to attend a preparatory school for an extra year just to qualify for university admission. Even after finally getting into university, he was such a mediocre student that after graduation, he couldn't get an academic position. None of his professors would recommend him. He applied for teaching jobs, assistant positions, anything in academia. Rejection after rejection. His letters went unanswered. His credentials were dismissed. The academic world he'd sacrificed everything for had closed its doors. So Galois did what brilliant, desperate people have always done. He turned to revolution. France, in 1830, was a powder keg. The conservative monarchy of Charles X was tightening its grip. Press freedoms were being crushed. Elections were being manipulated. And in the streets of Paris, young people were organizing. Galois joined the Republican movement. He wrote political articles. He attended meetings. He wasn't just some mathematician dabbling in politics on the side. He threw himself in completely. Because here's what you need to understand about Galois at this point in his life. He wasn't choosing between mathematics and politics. In his mind, they were the same fight. Both were about truth. Both were about systems that excluded brilliant ideas simply because they came from the wrong people. Both were about tearing down old hierarchies that protected mediocrity and punished innovation. The French Academy rejected his work because it threatened their comfortable understanding of mathematics. The monarchy rejected reform because it threatened their comfortable grip on power. To Galois, these were the same enemy. In July 1830, revolution came. The July Revolution, they called it. 3 days of fighting in the streets of Paris. Barricades. Gunfire. Charles X was overthrown. Galois was 17 years old, and he was ready to be part of it. But here's the cruel irony. His school, the École Préparatoire, locked its students inside during the revolution. For their safety, they said. So while history was being made in the streets outside, Galois was trapped inside, listening to the sound of gunfire, knowing he was missing the moment he'd been waiting for. When it was over, the director who'd locked them in gave a speech praising the revolution, the same man who'd kept them from participating. Galois stood up and publicly denounced him as a coward. He was expelled. Again. And here's where it gets darker, because Galois didn't just lose his academic standing. He lost his compass. Without school, without structure, he threw himself into the one thing that seemed to burn as hot as his mathematics: politics. Revolutionary politics. The kind that gets you noticed by people with badges and guns. This was 1832, France. The July Revolution had just toppled one king and installed another. The streets still smelled like gunpowder and broken promises. And Galois, barely 19, joined the artillery of the National Guard, a militia unit so radical, so openly hostile to the new monarchy, that it was disbanded within months. He wore the uniform anyway. In public, as an act of defiance, they arrested him for it. He was acquitted, but the message was clear. They were watching him now. And maybe, just maybe, some part of him wanted them to. Because when you've been rejected by every institution that was supposed to recognize your genius, when your work has been lost, dismissed, ignored, revolution starts to look like the only language anyone understands. On May 9th, 1831, at a banquet celebrating the acquittal of several Republicans, Galois stood up. He raised his glass and his knife. According to witnesses, he proposed a toast, though what exactly he said is disputed. Some said it was a toast to Louis Philippe, the king. Others said he held the knife in a threatening manner while saying the king's name. It was ambiguous, deliberately so, the kind of gesture that's both a threat and deniable. But in a room full of informants, ambiguity is guilt. Alexandre Dumas, yes, that Dumas, the author of The Three Musketeers, was at that dinner. He wrote about it later, about how the room went silent, about how Galois' friends tried to hustle him out, about how the police were waiting outside. They arrested him the next day. This time, he wasn't acquitted. 6 months in prison. And here, in a cell, is where Évariste Galois tried to make sense of mathematics that the greatest minds of his generation couldn't grasp. 6 months in a cell. 20 years old. No colleagues, no library, no academic community. Just Galois, his mind, and sheets of paper that prison guards probably thought were covered in nonsense. But here's what makes this period so heartbreaking and so brilliant at the same time. Most mathematicians need conversation. They need to present ideas at conferences, to argue with peers, to test theories in front of audiences who can challenge them. Galois had none of that. He was completely, utterly alone with ideas so revolutionary that even explaining them would require inventing new language. And yet, in that isolation, something extraordinary happened. He refined his theories. He worked on problems that connected geometry to algebra in ways no one had imagined. He developed what we now call Galois theory, though he simply called it a method for determining whether equations could be solved by radicals. That phrase probably means nothing to most of us, but here's why it mattered. For centuries, mathematicians had formulas for solving equations. The quadratic formula from high school, that's for second-degree equations. There were formulas for third-degree, fourth-degree equations too, though they got increasingly complicated. But fifth-degree equations, no one could find a general formula. Mathematicians had been trying for hundreds of years. Galois proved why. He showed that for fifth-degree equations and higher, no such formula could exist. Not because mathematicians weren't clever enough, but because of the fundamental structure of mathematics itself. It's like proving that you can't build a staircase to the moon, not because you lack materials, but because of how space and gravity work. But more than that, he created an entirely new way of looking at equations. He showed that every equation has a hidden symmetry, a structure that determines what's possible and what isn't. He invented the concept of groups in mathematics, objects that capture the essence of symmetry itself. And this is where things get beautiful, in a way that's hard to explain, because what Galois discovered wasn't just about equations, it was about reality itself. Think about a snowflake, perfect six-fold symmetry, each branch mirroring the others. You can rotate it 60 degrees, and it looks identical. That's not an accident. That's mathematics made visible. The same group theory that Galois invented to solve equations also describes why snowflakes form the way they do, why crystals have the shapes they have, why molecules arrange themselves in specific patterns. Or think about music. When you play a chord on a piano, then shift every note up by the same interval, it's still recognizably the same chord. That's symmetry. That's group theory. The relationships between the notes remain constant even as the notes themselves change. Composers have been using this instinctively for centuries, but Galois gave us the mathematical language to understand why it works. He showed that symmetry isn't just aesthetic, it's fundamental. It's what makes the universe comprehensible at all. And here's the thing that gets me every single time I think about it. Galois figured this out alone, completely alone. He had no collaborators, no mentors who understood what he was doing, no internet to connect with other mathematicians working on similar problems. He was a teenager in Paris, politically active, constantly in trouble, and in the spaces between protests and prison cells, he was rewriting the foundations of mathematics. The night before the duel, he knew. He must have known. The letter he wrote to his friend Auguste Chevalier wasn't just a mathematical testament. It was a cry for recognition, a desperate plea for someone, anyone, to understand what he'd seen. That letter haunts me, written in the frantic hours before dawn, before the duel that would end everything. Galois wasn't just recording mathematics. He was racing against his own mortality, scribbling theorems and proofs in the margins, writing notes to himself. I have no time. I have no time. Imagine that. Being 20 years old and knowing with absolute certainty that you're about to die. Not in some distant, abstract way. Tomorrow, at dawn, with pistols. And instead of writing to your mother, instead of making peace with the world, you're trying to explain group theory to posterity. What does that say about brilliance? What does it say about obsession? The night before he died, Galois created what we now call Galois theory, a framework so elegant, so powerful, that it answered questions mathematicians had been asking for centuries. Why can't we solve quintic equations the way we solve quadratics? Why do some geometric constructions work while others don't? What is symmetry, really, in its purest mathematical form? He answered all of it, in one night, with a duel waiting at sunrise, and then he folded the papers, sealed them in an envelope, and walked out into the morning mist of Paris to meet his fate. Here's what gets me about that duel. We still don't know exactly why it happened. The official story says it was over a woman. Some accounts name her as Stéphanie Félicie Potterin du Motel, the daughter of a physician. Others say it was political, that Galois was set up by government agents who wanted to silence a revolutionary voice. But there's another theory, one that keeps me up at night. What if Galois wanted to die? Not in a simple, straightforward way, but in the way that someone who sees too clearly, who understands too deeply, who exists on a plane so far beyond everyone else that communication becomes torture. What if he was just tired? Tired of being misunderstood, tired of having his papers rejected, tired of explaining himself to mathematicians who couldn't grasp what he was saying, tired of living in a world that had no use for him. So Nash did what any reasonable person would do when reality becomes unbearable. He stopped participating in it. He began writing letters, bizarre, rambling letters to governments, to embassies, to the United Nations. He claimed to be receiving coded messages from newspapers. He saw patterns that didn't exist, connections that made perfect sense only to him. The same mind that had revolutionized game theory was now playing games with itself. His colleagues at MIT noticed. They didn't know what to say. Here was a man who had been brilliant beyond measure, now standing at a blackboard, writing nonsense that looked like mathematics but led nowhere. The equations were syntactically correct but semantically empty, like poetry written in a language that doesn't exist. In 1959, Nash was hospitalized, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The irony is almost too perfect. A man who spent his career trying to predict human behavior, to model the mind mathematically, now betrayed by his own mind. The ultimate unpredictable opponent himself. The treatments were brutal. This was the late 950 seconds and early 60 seconds. We didn't know much about mental illness. We knew even less about treating it humanely. Insulin shock therapy. They'd inject him with insulin until his blood sugar dropped so low he'd go into a coma. The theory was that somehow shocking the brain would reset it, like unplugging a computer and plugging it back in. It didn't work, at least not in any way that mattered. Nash spent years drifting in and out of hospitals. His wife Alicia divorced him in 1963, though she never truly abandoned him. She understood something crucial. The man she married was still in there somewhere, trapped behind the static of his illness. During his lucid moments, Nash was aware of what was happening to him, and that might have been the cruelest part. Imagine understanding that your mind, the very thing that defines you, is lying to you, that the thoughts you're thinking might be symptoms, that you can't trust yourself. This is what makes schizophrenia so terrifying. It's not just about seeing things that aren't there. It's about the complete erosion of your reality's foundation. Every interaction becomes suspect. Every smile could be mockery. Every glance could be surveillance. And here's what people don't understand. The delusions aren't random. They're often deeply personal, woven from the fabric of someone's life, their fears, their culture, their experiences. A religious person might believe they're receiving messages from God or being punished by demons. Someone with trauma might construct elaborate conspiracies that mirror their past betrayals. The brain doesn't just malfunction, it tells stories. Dark, twisted stories that make emotional sense even when they defy logic. There's a young woman named Cecilia, not her real name, who developed schizophrenia in her early 20s. She was an art student, creative, sensitive. Her first break came during finals week. She started believing that her professors were part of a secret society, that they were putting coded messages in their feedback on her work. She thought her paintings were being photographed and sold without her knowledge, that cameras were hidden in the studio, that other students were in on it. To everyone else, she seemed paranoid, delusional. But to Cecilia, every piece fit together perfectly. The way her professor lingered when looking at her work, clearly assessing its value for resale. The whispered conversations between classmates, obviously discussing their surveillance operation. The exhaustion she felt, proof she was being drugged. Her reality was airtight, logical, consistent, and completely false. That's the trap. Schizophrenia doesn't feel like illness from the inside. It feels like revelation, like finally seeing the truth everyone else is too blind or complicit to acknowledge. Trying to convince someone their delusions aren't real is like trying to convince you right now that you're not actually reading this. The evidence is right there in front of you. How could you possibly be wrong? That's the cognitive fortress a delusion builds. And the more someone challenges it, the stronger the walls become. There's actually a term for this in psychology, the backfire effect. When core beliefs are threatened with contradictory evidence, people don't reconsider. They dig in deeper. The challenge doesn't weaken the belief. It reinforces it. Now, imagine that happening inside your own mind, with a belief you never consciously chose. This is why treatment for delusional disorder is so incredibly difficult. You can't logic someone out of a delusion. You can't present evidence that dismantles it, because the delusion isn't built on logic or evidence in the first place. It's woven into the very fabric of how that person experiences reality. Some clinicians try what's called gentle challenging. not directly confronting the delusion, but asking questions around its edges. How do you know they're following you? Have you ever seen the same person twice? What would it mean if they weren't actually following you? But even this requires immense trust between patient and therapist. And trust is something people with persecutory delusions struggle with fundamentally. Other approaches focus not on the delusion itself, but on reducing distress and improving functioning despite it. If someone believes their neighbors are spying on them, maybe the goal isn't convincing them otherwise. It's helping them feel safe enough to leave their apartment anyway. There are medications that can help, particularly antipsychotics that adjust dopamine signaling. But here's the catch. You have to believe you're ill to take medication for an illness. And if your delusion is that doctors are part of the conspiracy against you, well, you see the problem. This creates a heartbreaking paradox. The very nature of the condition makes people resistant to the help they desperately need. Families watch their loved ones disappear into isolated worlds of fear and suspicion, unable to reach them, because you can't extend a hand to someone who's convinced you're holding a weapon. And here's what makes it even more heartbreaking. Paranoia doesn't just steal the present, it rewrites the past. When someone is deep in paranoid thinking, their memories become unreliable narrators. That kind conversation you had last week? Now it's reinterpreted as veiled threats. The concerned looks from family? Evidence of a conspiracy they've been planning for months, maybe years. The mind reaches backward through time, finding patterns that never existed, connecting dots that were never on the same page. There's a phenomenon psychologists call retrospective reinterpretation. It's when someone with paranoia looks back at their entire life history through the lens of their current delusions. That childhood friend who moved away? They were probably placed there by whoever's watching now. That job you didn't get 5 years ago? Not bad luck, but deliberate sabotage. The paranoid mind creates a coherent story that explains everything, and the more memories it incorporates, the more proof it seems to have. It's watching someone revise their autobiography in real time, turning a life story into a thriller where they were never safe to begin with. And relationships crumble under this weight. Partners wake up one day to discover they're no longer trusted with the bank accounts. Parents find themselves accused of poisoning the food they lovingly prepared. Children learn to tiptoe around their paranoid parent, becoming smaller and quieter, trying not to trigger the next accusation. The person with paranoia feels increasingly validated in their suspicions because people are acting differently around them now. They don't realize they've created a self-fulfilling prophecy. What makes this particularly cruel is that paranoia often targets the people who care most. It's not random. The delusions frequently center on those closest to the person, because those are the relationships with the most emotional significance. Your brain doesn't waste paranoid energy on strangers. It focuses on people who matter, transforming love into suspicion, transforming trust into surveillance. There's something particularly cruel about how Capgras syndrome affects daily routines. Imagine sitting across the breakfast table from someone you've shared thousands of mornings with. The coffee smells the same. The kitchen looks the same. But the person pouring your coffee is, in your mind, a skilled actor who studied your spouse's mannerisms, perfected their voice, memorized their habits. You watch them butter toast exactly the way your real partner would. You notice they remember to add the right amount of sugar to your coffee. And this precise accuracy doesn't comfort you. It terrifies you. Because in your mind, it proves how thorough the deception is, how carefully this imposter has prepared for their role. Caregivers describe the exhaustion of being continuously distrusted by someone they love. They describe trying to prove their identity, showing photographs, recounting shared memories, bringing in other family members for verification. None of it works. Because the problem isn't a lack of evidence. The evidence is all there, perfectly intact. The problem is that the emotional verification system has stopped working, and without that feeling of familiarity, no amount of logical proof generates recognition. It's like trying to convince someone they're hungry by showing them pictures of food. You're addressing the wrong system entirely. The syndrome often targets one specific person, while leaving recognition of others intact. A husband might seem like an imposter, while children remain recognizable. A wife might be replaced, while friends remain genuine. This selectivity reveals something about the neural architecture of recognition. We don't have one general recognition system. We have multiple, specialized systems for different categories of relationships, and damage can affect them independently. Your brain maintains separate files for different kinds of love, different types of familiarity. There's a documented case of a man who could still recognize his wife's face perfectly. He could pick her out in a crowd of hundreds, but lost all emotional connection to that recognition. He knew intellectually who she was. He could recite facts about their life together. But when he looked at her, he felt nothing. The warmth, the familiarity, the sense of home that her face had always triggered, gone. His visual recognition was intact, but the pathway connecting that recognition to his emotional centers had been severed. He was looking at a stranger who happened to have his wife's face. The opposite can happen too. There are people who can't consciously recognize faces at all. Every face is unfamiliar, but their bodies still respond. Their skin conductance changes when they see someone they know. Their heart rate shifts. Some part of their brain still recognizes, still remembers, even though that information never reaches conscious awareness. They look at their mother and feel a vague sense of comfort they can't explain, staring at what their conscious mind insists is a complete stranger. Your brain is not one unified system. It's a collection of systems that usually work in harmony but can fall catastrophically out of sync. And when they do, the experience is existentially unsettling in ways that are hard to articulate. Here's what keeps me up at night. How much of our sense of self depends on recognition. Not just being able to recognize others, but being recognized ourselves. Being seen, being known. When someone with prosopagnosia looks at you blankly, when they ask your name for the third time that week, when they walk past you without acknowledgement, there's a small death that happens. You become invisible, and if enough people couldn't recognize you, if your face failed to register in anyone's mind as someone specific, someone known, would you still be you? This is the terror that lives beneath the surface of every social interaction. The fear that we are, all of us, one disrupted pattern away from becoming strangers to the people who know us best. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because prosopagnosia doesn't just affect the person who has it, it ripples outward, touching everyone in their orbit. Imagine being the spouse of someone with face blindness. You walk toward them in a crowded place, smiling, expecting recognition, expecting that moment of connection that comes when someone you love sees you. But their eyes pass over you. They look at you the way they look at everyone else, blank, searching, uncertain. You have to wave. You have to call out. You have to constantly reintroduce yourself to the person who shares your bed. Some partners of people with prosopagnosia report feeling a profound sense of loneliness in the relationship, not because their partner doesn't love them, but because that immediate, automatic recognition, that spark of "I know you, you're mine," never happens. It has to be conscious, effortful, a choice rather than an instinct. Children of parents with prosopagnosia often describe similar experiences, coming home from school and watching their parents scan their face, just for a second, before context fills in what perception cannot provide. The momentary hesitation before, "Welcome home, sweetie." Most learn to compensate. They wear distinctive clothing. They call out before entering a room. They accept that their parent will need contextual clues. But some describe a lingering feeling of not being time seen asterisk, even when they're being looked at directly. And yet, the people with prosopagnosia themselves often don't realize they're different until surprisingly late in life. They assume everyone navigates the world the way they do by gait, by voice, by location and context. One woman didn't discover her face blindness until she was in her 40s. She'd spent her entire life thinking everyone else was just exceptionally good at recognizing people. She assumed they, like her, were using clothing and context, but somehow did it faster, more efficiently. The revelation came when she described her recognition strategies to a friend who stared at her in confusion and said, "But don't you just look at their face?" That single question changed everything. The friend explained that faces contained immediate, recognizable information, that everyone's face was as distinct as their name, as obvious as their height. For someone with prosopagnosia, this explanation lands like discovering that everyone else has been reading a language you didn't know existed. Sarah began researching. She learned that prosopagnosia exists on a spectrum. Some people can't recognize their own parents. Others struggle only with acquaintances. She fell somewhere in the middle. Close family members were recognizable through accumulated context, but anyone outside that inner circle became a stranger the moment they changed location or appearance. The diagnosis explained decades of awkward moments. The time she didn't recognize her college roommate at the grocery store because she'd never seen her outside their dorm. The neighbor who thought she was cold and unfriendly because she greeted him some days and not others really. She only recognized him when he was standing in front of his house. The humiliation of having a coworker think she was ignoring them when she simply didn't know who they were in the parking lot. What struck Sarah most was the effort she'd expended her entire life without realizing others weren't doing the same thing. While her colleagues processed facial recognition automatically, she was running constant calculations. Height plus gait plus clothing plus location plus voice equals probably Jennifer. Her brain was solving complex equations while everyone else was reading single-digit addition. And she thought everyone worked this hard. She thought everyone memorized the makes and models of coworkers' cars to know who was in the parking lot. She'd thought everyone felt that spike of anxiety when someone approached them in an unexpected context. She'd thought this was just what commitment looked like, what dedication meant, what successful people did to stay ahead. But here's the thing about normalizing the abnormal: it doesn't just distort your present, it rewrites your entire history. After diagnosis, she started looking back at her childhood with new eyes. All those things she'd been told were just quirks or phases or things she needed to work harder to overcome. Suddenly they had a different name, a different explanation. The way she'd organize her toys in perfect lines and feel genuine distress when someone moved them, not just childish rigidity, a need for predictability in a world that felt chaotic. The way she'd refused to wear certain fabrics, and her mother had called her difficult, dramatic, too picky. Not manipulation, actual physical discomfort that she couldn't articulate because she didn't have the words yet. The way she'd memorized entire books and recite them word for word, and everyone thought it was impressive. A party trick. Not showing off echolalia, a way of processing and communicating that felt safer than generating original speech in high-pressure social moments. The way she'd had what her family called tantrums, that seemed to come out of nowhere, sudden explosions of emotion that she couldn't control or explain. Not bad behavior meltdowns triggered by sensory overload, social confusion, or the accumulated stress of masking all day at school. Every memory gained a new annotation, a different lens. And this is what late diagnosis does. It asks you to relearn your own story, to take the narrative you've been telling yourself for decades and translate it into a language you're only now beginning to understand. The grief of that is complex, because on one hand, there's relief, validation, finally, an explanation that makes sense, that honors what you actually experienced instead of what people told you that you experienced. But on the other hand, there's loss, all those years of misunderstanding yourself, all that effort spent trying to fix things that weren't broken, just different. All those moments when you needed support and received criticism instead. It's like living your entire life believing you were bad at reading, only to discover you needed glasses the whole time. The words were always there. Your brain was always capable. But without the right lens, everything stayed blurry and confusing. And here's something that really gets to me about late diagnosis: the layers of compensation you built just to survive. You developed this entire architecture of workarounds, Some so automatic you don't even recognize them anymore. Maybe you learn to schedule everything down to the minute because your natural sense of time is completely unreliable. Maybe you avoid restaurants where you have to order at a counter because processing information while people wait behind you triggers instant panic. Maybe you have elaborate systems for where you put your keys, your phone, your wallet, because without them, these objects simply vanish into an alternate dimension. These adaptations aren't weakness. They're actually evidence of incredible resourcefulness and intelligence. You figured out how to function in a world not designed for your brain, often without any support or understanding. But they came at a cost. Because when you spend that much energy just keeping your head above water, there's not much left over for actually swimming toward your goals. Every day becomes about survival rather than growth. About managing symptoms you couldn't even name rather than building the life you wanted. And the truly heartbreaking part? Many of these compensation strategies eventually stop working as effectively. As life gets more complex, as responsibilities multiply, as the demands on your executive function increase, those old workarounds start crumbling. The system that got you through college completely fails you in your career. The masking that worked in your 20s becomes unsustainable in your 30s. That's often when people finally seek diagnosis. Not because the ADHD suddenly appeared, but because the scaffolding they built to hide it finally collapsed under its own weight. And here's what nobody tells you about that collapse. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like finally telling the truth. When you stop pretending that taking 3 hours to respond to a simple email is just being thorough. When you admit that you've been reading the same paragraph for 20 minutes because your brain keeps wandering to that conversation you had in 2014. When you acknowledge that the reason you're always 10 minutes late isn't because you don't care, but because time genuinely feels like a liquid that slips through your fingers. That's not defeat. That's recognition. And recognition changes everything. Because once you understand that your brain isn't broken, just different, you can stop trying to fix yourself and start working with what you have. You can stop beating yourself up for not being neurotypical and start building systems that actually match how your mind works. This is where we need to talk about accommodations, not as weakness, but as architecture. Think about it this way. Nobody looks at a person using glasses and says, "Have you tried just squinting harder? Maybe if you really focused, your eyes would work properly." That would be absurd. Glasses aren't a moral failing, they're a tool that bridges the gap between how your eyes work and what the world demands of them. ADHD accommodations work the same way. They're not crutches. They're not shortcuts. They're not evidence that you're not trying hard enough. They're practical adjustments that acknowledge reality instead of fighting it. But here's where it gets complicated. We live in a world that worships the appearance of effortlessness. We're supposed to make everything look easy. Asking for help, using reminders, needing extra time, these things are often seen as admissions of inadequacy rather than intelligent adaptations. So, people with ADHD often refuse accommodations they desperately need because they're afraid of what it says about them. They'd rather suffer in silence than admit they need something different. I want you to sit with this for a moment. How much energy have you spent trying to look normal instead of actually being functional? How many hours have you lost to the performance of neurotypicality when you could have been using tools that actually work? Because that's the real cost of stigma. Not just the judgment from others, but the judgment you inflict on yourself. The accommodations you won't allow yourself. The help you won't ask for. The tools you won't use because using them would mean admitting something you're not ready to admit. Because here's what no one tells you about high-functioning depression. It's not just about hiding your pain from others. It's about hiding it from yourself. You've become so skilled at the performance that you've convinced yourself it's real. The mask isn't something you put on anymore, it's something you believe is your actual face. You tell yourself, "I'm fine, I'm just tired," and you mean it. You genuinely can't tell the difference anymore between normal fatigue and the crushing weight that makes getting out of bed feel like climbing Everest. You say, "I'm just stressed about work," and you believe it. Never mind that the dread you feel on Sunday nights has nothing to do with your actual workload and everything to do with the fact that you're running on empty and don't know how much longer you can keep this up. You rationalize. Everyone feels this way sometimes. And you're partially right, which makes it even harder to recognize that what you're experiencing isn't sometimes. It's constant. It's your baseline. It's the water you're swimming in, so omnipresent that you've forgotten what it feels like to breathe air. The gaslighting comes from inside the house. You minimize your own experience with the same dismissive language others might use. You're too smart, too self-aware, too functional to be really struggling, right? Except intelligence doesn't make you immune to depression. Self-awareness doesn't cure it. Functionality doesn't mean you're fine, it just means you're good at suffering quietly. And here's the cruelest part. The better you are at functioning, the longer you'll wait to get help. Because as long as you're meeting your responsibilities, as long as the external markers of your life look acceptable, you can tell yourself it's not that bad. The bar for bad enough keeps rising. You think, I'll get help when I can't get out of bed anymore, but you still get out of bed. I'll reach out when I can't work anymore, but you're still working. I'll say something when I genuinely can't cope, but you're coping. Barely, exhaustedly, miserably, but you're coping. So the threshold never arrives. You keep pushing it further back, moving the goalposts of your own suffering, waiting for some dramatic breaking point that justifies asking for help. And here's the cruelest irony. The world rewards you for this. Every time you drag yourself to work despite feeling hollow inside, every time you smile through the exhaustion, every time you say, I'm fine when you're barely holding on, you get validation. You get called resilient, strong, a survivor. And that validation becomes another chain. Because now you're not just enduring, you're performing endurance. You're the person who handles things, the one who doesn't complain, the one who shows up no matter what. And that identity, as toxic as it might be, gives you something to hold on to when everything else feels uncertain. So you keep going, and the gap between your external life and your internal experience grows wider. On the outside, career, relationships, responsibilities, the appearance of functionality. On the inside, a persistent, gnawing emptiness, a sense that you're watching your own life happen from behind soundproof glass. You're present but not times there asterisk. Alive but not living. This is what I call functional depression, and it's not just semantics. It's a specific psychological state that exists in the shadows of traditional mental health discourse. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic symptoms. There's no sudden inability to get out of bed, no obvious crisis that forces intervention. Instead, it's the slow erosion of joy, the gradual draining of color from your world, the quiet conviction that this muted half-life is simply what adulthood feels like. The medical establishment struggles with this. Diagnostic criteria look for impairment, measurable, observable dysfunction. But what happens when you've become so skilled at compensating that the dysfunction is invisible? What happens when your coping mechanisms are so effective that they mask the underlying condition, even from yourself? You develop what psychologists call high-functioning depression, though I'd argue that term is misleading. You're not functioning well. You're functioning despite everything. There's a difference between thriving and merely not collapsing, between living and just not dying. And the longer this goes on, the more it rewires your brain. Neuroplasticity works both ways. Just as you can build positive patterns, you can entrench negative ones. Every day you push through without addressing the underlying pain. You're teaching your nervous system that this is normal. This is baseline. This is what life is. And here's what happens at the neurological level that most people don't realize. Your brain has something called a negativity bias. It's an evolutionary feature designed to keep you alive by remembering threats more vividly than rewards. But when you're in chronic emotional pain, this bias goes into overdrive. Your amygdala, the alarm center of your brain, becomes hyperactive. It starts flagging neutral experiences as potentially dangerous. Someone doesn't text back immediately? Your brain interprets it as rejection, as evidence you're not wanted, a minor critique at work. Your nervous system reads it as a full-scale threat to your identity. This isn't you being too sensitive. This is your brain operating from a baseline of pain, where everything feels like confirmation of your worst fears about yourself. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for perspective, reasoning, and emotional regulation, gets quieter. It's like the wise, measured voice in your head gets drowned out by the alarm bells. You lose access to your ability to step back and see situations clearly. Everything becomes filtered through the lens of your pain. And your body? Your body keeps the score, as they say. Chronic emotional pain doesn't just live in your thoughts, it embeds itself in your tissues, your muscles, your gut. That tightness in your chest that never quite goes away. The tension in your shoulders that no amount of stretching seems to release. The digestive issues that appeared out of nowhere. The fatigue that sleep doesn't cure. These aren't separate problems. They're your body expressing what your mind has been trying to suppress. The research on adverse childhood experiences shows us that unresolved emotional pain literally changes how our genes express themselves. It affects our immune system, our cardiovascular health, our susceptibility to chronic illness. The invisible wound has very visible consequences, even if it takes years to connect the dots. But perhaps the cruelest part is how we judge ourselves for all of this. We look at our hypervigilance and call it anxiety. We look at our emotional numbness and call it depression. We look at our inability to trust and call it being damaged. We pathologize our pain instead of recognizing it as an intelligent response to difficult circumstances. You're not broken. You're not defective. You're not too much or not enough. You're hurt. And hurt people don't need more shame. They need acknowledgement. They need space to finally feel what they've been running from. Because here's what happens when you finally stop running. You don't fall apart. You fall times into times yourself. And yes, at first, it feels like collapsing, like the ground is giving way beneath you, like every emotion you've been holding back is flooding in all at once. But that's not destruction. That's thawing. That's what it feels like when something frozen finally starts to melt. For years, maybe decades, you've been living in a state of emotional permafrost. Everything locked down, preserved, kept at a distance, and it worked. It kept you functional. It kept you moving forward, but it also kept you numb. And now, as you stop running, as you let yourself feel, it's like spring coming to a tundra, messy, overwhelming, a little chaotic, but also alive. You start noticing things you haven't noticed in years. The weight of your own body in a chair, the actual taste of your coffee, the way your chest rises and falls with each breath. Small things, ordinary things. But when you've been dissociated for so long, the ordinary feels miraculous. You start crying at commercials, getting angry at minor inconveniences, laughing at jokes that aren't even that funny. And it feels destabilizing because you're not used to times feeling times this much. But here's the thing. You're not losing control. Your times regaining times it. Because real control isn't about suppressing your emotions. It's about being able to feel them without being destroyed by them. It's about knowing that you can be sad without being swallowed by despair, angry without becoming destructive, afraid without being paralyzed. That's what emotional regulation actually is. Not the absence of feeling, but the capacity to hold feeling. And you can't build that capacity while you're running. You build it by standing still, by letting the wave come, by discovering that you can survive the intensity of your own inner life. This is the work that nobody talks about, the unglamorous, uncomfortable, daily practice of just being with yourself. Not improving yourself, not optimizing yourself, not fixing yourself, just being, sitting with the discomfort, noticing the thoughts without believing all of them, feeling the feelings without making them mean something catastrophic about who you are. It sounds simple. It's not easy, because your nervous system has been programmed to interpret stillness as danger. But there's a practice that can help rewire that programming. It's called mindful stillness, and it's different from meditation, though the two overlap. Meditation often has a goal: calm the mind, reach enlightenment, achieve inner peace. Mindful stillness has no goal. It's simply the practice of being present in your body without needing to change anything. You sit, you notice, you don't judge, you don't fix, you just observe what's happening inside you without trying to make it different. This is incredibly difficult for most people, because the moment you sit still, everything you've been running from catches up. The anxiety, the grief, the restlessness, the shame, all of it surfaces, and your first instinct is to get up, to distract yourself, to do something, anything, to make the discomfort stop. But mindful stillness asks you to stay, not to wallow in the discomfort, but to simply acknowledge it, to sit with it like you'd sit with an old friend who's going through something hard. You don't need to solve it. You just need to be there. Over time, something remarkable happens. The discomfort doesn't disappear, but your relationship with it changes. You begin to realize that feelings, no matter how intense, are just visitors. They come, they peak, they pass. You start to notice the space between thoughts, the quiet that exists beneath the noise, and slowly, your nervous system begins to learn a new truth. Stillness is not danger. Stillness is home. This is the foundation of nervous system regulation. Not controlling your emotions, but expanding your capacity to be with them. Not eliminating stress, but building resilience in the face of it. And here's what most people don't realize. This work doesn't just change how you feel. It changes how you show up in the world. When you're no longer running from yourself, you stop running from others. When you can sit with your own discomfort, you can hold space for someone else's pain. When you're regulated, you become a calming presence in a world that desperately needs it. You become the person who doesn't escalate conflict, the friend who can listen without needing to fix, the parent who can stay grounded when their child is melting down. This isn't about perfection. You'll still get triggered. You'll still react. You'll still have moments where you snap or shut down or spiral. But you'll recover faster. You'll notice sooner, and you'll have tools to bring yourself back to center instead of staying stuck in dysregulation for hours or days. And those tools? They're simpler than you think. One of the most powerful ones is something called glimmers. We talk a lot about triggers, those moments that send us into fight or flight, but glimmers are the opposite. They're tiny moments of safety, connection, or peace that signal to your nervous system, asterisk, you're okay, you can relax now, asterisk. A glimmer might be the warmth of sunlight on your face, the sound of your dog's tail wagging when you come home, a text from someone who genuinely gets you, the first sip of coffee in a quiet morning. These aren't grand gestures, they're micro moments. But when you start noticing them, when you let yourself pause and take them in, they begin to rewire your nervous system towards safety instead of threat. I started keeping what I call a glimmer list. Every evening, I'd write down 3 tiny moments from the day that made me feel even slightly okay. At first, it felt forced. My brain wanted to focus on everything that went wrong. But over time, I noticed something shift. My system started looking for those moments during the day, not just in retrospect. I was training my nervous system to notice safety the same way it had been trained to notice danger. Another tool, movement, not exercise movement. There's a difference. Exercise often comes with pressure, goals, timers. Movement is gentle. It's shaking out your hands when you feel anxious, rolling your shoulders when tension creeps in, taking a short walk with no destination, dancing alone in your kitchen to one song. When you're dysregulated, your body is holding all that activation. Talk therapy alone won't release it. You have to move it through. I used to think I could think my way out of anxiety. Spoiler, you can't. Your body needs to discharge that energy. So I'd go outside and walk, no podcast, no music, just walking, and I'd feel the ground under my feet. I'd let my arms swing, and slowly, the tightness would ease. There's also something called co-regulation. This is where you borrow someone else's calm nervous system to help regulate your own. It's why being around a grounded, safe person can make you feel better even if you don't talk about what's wrong. Their regulated state literally helps regulate yours. But here's the catch. You have to be around people who are actually regulated. If you're surrounded by chaos, even well-meaning chaos, it's going to keep you activated. That's not judgment, it's biology. Your nervous system is constantly scanning your environment for cues of safety or danger, and people are part of that environment. This is why boundaries matter so much in nervous system healing. It's not about cutting people off. It's about creating space where your system can actually rest. Sometimes that means saying no to plans. Sometimes it means limiting time with people who leave you feeling drained. Sometimes it means choosing solitude over forced socializing, even when the world tells you that's unhealthy. Because here's what the world doesn't tell you. Solitude isn't the same as loneliness. Loneliness is a painful feeling of isolation, a sense that you're disconnected from others even when you want connection. Solitude is a choice. It's intentional time alone that recharges you, that lets you hear your own thoughts without the constant noise of other people's opinions, expectations, and energy. Think about the difference. Loneliness feels heavy, like a weight on your chest. Solitude feels light, like finally being able to breathe. Loneliness makes you desperate for connection. Solitude makes you selective about who you connect with. Loneliness drains you. Solitude restores you. And yet, when you choose solitude, people worry. They ask if you're okay. They say things like, "You need to get out more," or "Humans aren't meant to be alone." They treat your need for space as if it's a problem to be solved, a symptom of something wrong with you. But what if there's nothing wrong with you? What if you simply understand something that many people don't? That the quality of your connections matters more than the quantity. That one deep conversation with someone who truly sees you is worth more than 100 surface-level interactions. The truth is, highly sensitive people often have smaller social circles, not because they struggle with connection, but because they value authentic connection so much that they won't settle for anything less. They'd rather have 3 friends who really understand them than 30 acquaintances who only know the surface version of who they are. This doesn't make them antisocial. It makes them intentional. It makes them careful about where they invest their limited social energy. Because every interaction is an investment, and they've learned through painful experience that some investments drain their account without giving anything back. So they become selective. They start paying attention to how they feel after spending time with different people. They notice which relationships leave them feeling energized and understood, and which ones leave them feeling exhausted and misunderstood. They discover that introversion isn't about disliking people, it's about being intentional with their social energy. They realize they can be warm, caring, and deeply invested in relationships without needing to maintain dozens of surface-level connections. Their friend group naturally becomes smaller, but infinitely richer. Instead of spreading themselves thin across 20 acquaintances, they invest deeply in 5 or 6 people who truly get them. These relationships have depth. There's history, trust, vulnerability. Conversations pick up where they left off, even after months of silence. And here's what's beautiful about these friendships. There's no performance required. They don't have to be on. They can show up tired, struggling, uncertain, and be met with understanding rather than judgment. They can sit in comfortable silence. They can cancel plans without elaborate explanations. They can text, "Not feeling social today," and receive, "Completely understand, take care of yourself," in return. These friendships become sanctuaries. safe spaces where they can lower their guard completely, where they're not constantly monitoring their energy levels or calculating how long until they can politely excuse themselves, where they can be fully, authentically themselves without translation or performance. They also learn to communicate their needs more clearly. Instead of making vague excuses or ghosting when overwhelmed, they start being honest. I need some recharge time this weekend. I'm feeling overstimulated. Can we reschedule? I'd love to see you, but I'm at my social capacity for today. And the people who matter, the ones worth keeping, understand. They don't take it personally. They don't guilt or pressure. They respect boundaries because the relationship is built on mutual understanding rather than constant availability. The introvert discovers that quality trumps quantity in every aspect of connection. One deep conversation means more than a dozen shallow exchanges. One genuine friend who understands their need for solitude is worth more than 10 who constantly demand their presence. One relationship where they can be authentic is more nourishing than dozens where they have to perform. This selectivity extends beyond just friendships. They become more discerning about all their commitments. They start saying no to invitations that don't align with their values. They stop volunteering for projects that drain them just to appear helpful. They recognize that their time and energy are finite resources, and burnout taught them the cost of spreading themselves too thin. This isn't selfishness, it's self-preservation with purpose. They're creating boundaries that honor both their limitations and their deeper priorities. A social butterfly who once attended every gathering might now skip the party to spend Saturday morning in their garden. Not because they've become antisocial, but because they've discovered that 2 hours of quiet cultivation feeds their soul more than 4 hours of small talk ever could. They become comfortable disappointing people in small ways to avoid betraying themselves in big ways. They understand that you can't please everyone, and the attempt to do so was part of what broke them in the first place. So they choose carefully, invest deliberately, and build a life that's smaller in scope but infinitely richer in meaning. Their relationship with achievement shifts fundamentally. The person who once chased promotion after promotion, credential after credential, now questions what they're actually climbing toward. Burnout stripped away the illusion that external validation could fill internal voids. They start measuring success differently. Not by titles or salary or social media metrics, but by more subtle indicators, how they feel on Sunday evening, whether they have energy for the people they love, if they're learning and growing in ways that matter to them personally, not just professionally. This doesn't mean they become unmotivated or lazy. Often, they're more productive than ever, but the productivity serves different masters now. They're no longer performing achievement, they're pursuing meaning. The distinction is everything. They might leave a prestigious job for one that pays less but offers better boundaries. They might pivot entirely to a field that fascinates them, even if it means starting over. Or they might stay in the same role but completely redefine their relationship to it, letting go of the need to be the best, the first, the most indispensable. What makes this transition so profound isn't just the external change, it's the internal shift that happens first. Before they quit the job or set the boundary or leave the relationship, there's a moment where they stop defending their old choices. They stop telling themselves the story that made the sacrifice feel noble. They stop performing enthusiasm they don't feel. And that moment, that quiet internal letting go, is often invisible to everyone around them. To the outside world, they might look the same for months, still showing up, still performing, still delivering. But inside, something fundamental has already shifted. The emotional investment is gone. The identity is loosening. They're no longer trying to prove something. They're just done. This is why some burnout seems sudden to the people around them. A colleague who seemed fine last month suddenly resigns with no backup plan. A friend who never complained abruptly cuts contact. A partner who appeared committed walks away, but to the person experiencing it, nothing about it feels sudden. It's the culmination of 1,000 tiny moments of realization, of compromise, of swallowing resentment, of hoping things would change. The decision was made slowly, quietly, over years. The announcement is just the part other people finally see. And here's something important. This kind of burnout doesn't always lead to dramatic external change. Sometimes the shift is entirely internal. They stay in the same job, the same city, the same relationship, but the energy they bring to it is completely different. They stop overextending. They stop saying yes when they mean no. They stop carrying other people's emotions as if they're responsible for them. From the outside, everything looks the same, but the person living it knows everything has changed. This is the version of recovery that doesn't make for inspiring social media posts. There's no before and after photo, no exotic location or career pivot. Just someone quietly reclaiming their time, their attention, their sense of self. Just someone learning to exist without performing. And maybe that's the most radical version of all. Because here's what I've noticed. The people who quietly step back don't usually make grand announcements. They don't post a manifesto or burn their accounts in some dramatic finale. They just drift. Their stories stop appearing in your feed. Their last post sits there, unremarked upon, slowly sinking beneath the algorithmic tide. And months later, you might think of them and wonder how they're doing, and realize you have no idea, which is exactly how they want it. I think about the friends I've lost touch with not because we fought, not because anything went wrong, but because they stopped being digitally available. They stopped responding within minutes, stopped liking posts, and at first it felt like rejection, like they'd chosen something over our friendship. But now I understand they weren't choosing against me, they were choosing for themselves. Choosing presence over documentation, choosing the people in their physical space over the people in their notifications. And maybe that's the part that stings the realization that we were never as close as the constant contact suggested. That the daily exchange of memes and the instant reactions to stories created an illusion of intimacy that wasn't actually there. Real friendship, it turns out, can survive silence, can exist in the spaces between messages, doesn't require constant proof of its own existence. The invisible people understand this. They're not interested in maintaining relationships through performance, through the labor of constant engagement. They're willing to let connections fade if those connections were only ever held together by algorithmic proximity. And what remains, what survives, the absence of digital scaffolding, those are the relationships that matter. The ones that exist in phone calls instead of comments, in plans made deliberately, instead of standing invitations to hang out sometime, in actual presence instead of the simulation of it. There's a kind of sorting that happens when you go invisible, a natural filter. The people who truly care will find other ways to reach you, will pick up the phone, will show up. And the rest, well, the rest were never really there to begin with. They were audience members, spectators, people who enjoyed the show but weren't interested in the person behind it. And in those moments of clarity, I felt something profound. Not anger, not resentment, but a kind of quiet acceptance. These people weren't villains in my story. They were just people, living their own lives, making their own choices about where to invest their limited time and energy. I realized I had been operating under a faulty assumption. I thought that if I shared enough of myself, if I was interesting enough, entertaining enough, vulnerable enough, that people would naturally want to know me. That depth would automatically create connection. But that's not how it works. Connection requires mutual willingness. It requires both people to step forward, to take the risk, to choose each other repeatedly. You can't convince someone to care about you beyond a superficial level. You can't argue them into deeper friendship. Either they feel the pull toward knowing you more fully, or they don't. And if they don't, it's not a moral failing on their part. It's just incompatibility, a mismatch of needs and capacities. I started thinking about it differently. Imagine you're walking through a museum. There are hundreds of paintings on the walls. Some you glance at and keep moving. Others you pause in front of for a few seconds. And then there are those rare pieces that stop you completely, that make you pull up a bench and sit, that you return to again and again. We're all like that with people. Most individuals we encounter, we glance at and keep moving. Some we pause in front of briefly. We have pleasant surface interactions. We smile, we laugh at their jokes, we enjoy their presence in controlled doses, but we don't feel compelled to pull up a bench, to sit with them in the uncomfortable spaces, to return when things get messy or complex. And that's okay. That's not cruelty. That's just the reality of human selectivity. We can't deeply know everyone. We don't have the capacity, so we choose, often unconsciously, often based on factors we don't fully understand ourselves. The painful part isn't that people make these choices. The painful part is when you're on the receiving end and you didn't realize that's what was happening. When you thought you were building something substantial, but the other person saw it as something light and optional. When you were pulling up a bench, but they were already moving to the next painting. I had to grieve that disconnect. Had to mourn the friendships I thought I had but didn't. Had to release people from obligations they never actually signed up for, because I was holding them to standards they never agreed to meet. And that's when I realized I'd been the toxic one in some of those relationships. Not because I was cruel or manipulative, but because I'd been giving in order to get. Keeping score without telling anyone there was a game being played. I'd think, I listened to her problems for 3 hours last week, and she can't even text me back, as if emotional support was currency. As if friendship was supposed to operate like a transaction ledger that had to balance every single month. That's not friendship. That's a contract I wrote in invisible ink and then got angry when nobody honored it. So I had to grieve. Had to sit with the reality that maybe I wasn't the friend I thought I was either. Maybe my generosity had strings attached that I didn't want to acknowledge. Maybe my kindness was conditional, even though I swore it wasn't. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are just living their lives. They're not villains in our story. They're protagonists in their own. And in their version, maybe we're the ones who disappeared, the ones who changed, the ones who expected too much. I'm not saying nobody wronged you. I'm not saying betrayal isn't real, but I am saying that sometimes the story is more complicated than we want it to be. Sometimes both people are right, and both people are hurt, and nobody's the bad guy. There's just incompatibility, poor timing, different needs, mismatched expectations. The hard part? You still have to grieve it, even when nobody's at fault, even when it's just sad. Just life doing what life does, growing people in different directions, changing priorities, revealing that what worked at 23 doesn't work at 31. You grieve the version of them you thought you knew, the inside jokes that don't land anymore, the shorthand you developed that's now a foreign language, the plans you made that will never happen, the future you assumed you'd share that's been quietly cancelled without announcement. And nobody prepares you for how lonely that is. Because there's a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being the only one who remembers. Everyone else gets to move on. They get to fold that person neatly into the past tense, a chapter that closed, a story that ended. But you're stuck living in two timelines at once, the one where they're gone and the one where they should still be here. You'll be at a restaurant and think, oh, they would hate this music. You'll see a movie and mentally compose the text you'd send them about it. You'll have entire conversations with them in your head, anticipating their responses with such accuracy it hurts. And then you remember, this is a one-sided dialogue now. You're talking to a memory that can't talk back. People will sometimes ask you to describe them. What were they like? And you'll realize with sudden panic that you can't. Not really. Because how do you compress an entire human being into a paragraph? How do you explain someone's essence, their particular way of moving through the world, in a way that does them justice? You'll say things like funny or kind, and even as the words leave your mouth, they feel like betrayal, like you're reducing someone infinite down to greeting card adjectives. And here's what nobody mentions. Sometimes you'll forget them. Just for a second. You'll wake up, and it won't be the first thing you think about. You'll go a whole hour without that weight on your chest, and then you'll remember that you forgot, and the guilt is crushing. Like forgetting them even for a moment is another small death, another way you're letting them slip away. You'll start to panic that you're losing them twice, once to death, and once to the slow erosion of memory. The truth is, grief doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't come with built-in wisdom or spiritual evolution. Sometimes it just makes you bitter. Sometimes it makes you hard. You'll catch yourself thinking cruel thoughts. Why them and not someone else? Why them and not someone who mattered less? And then you'll hate yourself for thinking it, but you can't unfeel it. You'll discover that grief has a smell, not metaphorically, literally. When you walk into their house for the first time after, everything smells like them, but also like their absence. Their coffee cup is still in the sink, half full, the liquid inside turned to something else. Their laundry is still in the hamper, and you'll find yourself inhaling their shirts like an addict, trying to capture something that's already evaporating. Some people keep these items in sealed bags, rationing the scent like it's medicine, which, in a way, it is. You'll learn that the body keeps score in ways the mind hasn't even processed yet. Your shoulders will carry tension you didn't know existed. You'll clench your jaw so hard, you'll crack a tooth. You'll develop headaches that feel like your skull is trying to contain something too big for it. Your stomach will reject food, or demand it constantly, oscillating between extremes without warning. Sleep will become something that happens to you, not something you choose. You'll wake at 3 a.m. with your heart racing, convinced for a split second that it was all a dream, and then reality will crush you all over again. You'll notice how the world has divided into two categories: people who get it and people who don't. The ones who get it, you'll recognize instantly. There's a look in their eyes, a specific kind of knowing. They won't ask how you are. They'll ask what day it is, what hour you're in. They'll sit with you in silence without trying to fix anything. They'll text you on random Tuesdays just to say they're thinking of you. They won't expect responses. The ones who don't get it will say things that make you want to scream. At least they're not suffering anymore. As if your pain is an acceptable trade. God needed another angel. As if God is running some kind of collection agency. Everything happens for a reason. As if there's a reason good enough to justify this. You'll smile and nod because it's easier than explaining that their comfort is for them, not you. You'll realize that grief is the most lonely experience you can have in a room full of people. You'll learn to recognize the look in someone's eyes when they're about to say something that will hurt you, even though they think it will help. That half second before they speak, when you can see them mentally rehearsing their words, convincing themselves they're being profound. At least they're not suffering anymore. As if you're selfish for wanting more time, as if your love could only continue if their pain did. You'll want to tell them that you'd gladly take their suffering onto yourself if it meant one more conversation, one more ordinary Tuesday, one more chance to hear them complain about traffic or debate what to have for dinner. But you won't say any of this. You'll just nod and thank them for caring. You'll discover that anger becomes a frequent visitor. Not the hot, explosive kind that movies taught you to expect, but a cold, persistent anger that sits in your chest like a stone. Anger at the unfairness. Anger at people who still have what you lost. Anger at yourself for being angry. You'll feel it bubble up at strange moments. When someone complains about their mother calling too much. When a stranger takes for granted the exact thing you're grieving. When the world refuses to stop spinning just because yours has shattered. This anger will make you feel like a terrible person until you learn that it's just grief in a different costume, just love with nowhere left to go. You'll find yourself becoming a different person in conversations. You'll develop two versions of yourself, the one who tells people you're doing okay and moves the conversation along, and the real you who's barely holding it together. You'll become an expert at reading a room, at knowing instantly whether someone actually wants to know how you are, or just wants to hear that you're fine. Most want the second option, and you'll give it to them because you'll learn that your authentic grief makes people uncomfortable, and you're tired of managing other people's discomfort while drowning in your own. You'll discover that some people disappear not because they don't care, but because they care too much and don't know how to hold space for that much pain. Others vanish because your loss reminds them of their own mortality, their own fragile connections, the precarious nature of everything they're taking for granted. You become a mirror they'd rather not look into, and you'll learn to forgive them for it, not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you need the release that comes with letting go of one more thing you can't control. There's a profound loneliness that comes with this kind of loss that has nothing to do with being alone. You can be surrounded by people who love you, in a room full of support, and still feel utterly isolated because no one else is living inside your specific grief. No one else lost your exact relationship with that exact person. No one else is carrying your particular collection of memories, regrets, inside jokes, and unfinished conversations. Your loss is yours alone, and that's a solitude that can't be fixed by company. You'll find yourself becoming two people. There's the public you, the one who shows up to work and responds to texts and remembers to smile at appropriate moments. And then there's the private you, the one who's still having full conversations with the person you lost, who keeps their contact in your phone because deleting it feels like a second death, who sometimes forgets they're gone for just a split second before reality comes crashing back. You'll get very good at switching between these two selves, at putting on the mask that makes others comfortable. But the exhaustion of maintaining that split will become another layer of your grief. The world will expect you to move forward, to get back to normal, but you'll realize there is no going back. Normal died with them. You'll find yourself making compromises you never imagined. You'll laugh at a joke and feel guilty. You'll enjoy a meal and wonder if you deserve to. You'll have a good day and panic, thinking you're betraying their memory by experiencing joy. The grief police live inside your own head, enforcing rules nobody actually wrote but everyone seems to follow. And then there are the objects. The things they touched, wore, used. Each one becomes a relic, heavy with impossible significance. You can't throw away their toothbrush because it feels like erasing them, but you also can't look at it sitting there every morning without feeling your heart crack open. Their clothes hang in the closet, and you face an agonizing choice. Keep them and live in a shrine, or donate them and feel like you're giving pieces of them away to strangers who'll never know what those shirts meant, what memories are woven into that fabric. Some people keep everything, turning rooms into museums dedicated to someone who isn't coming back. Others purge quickly, desperately trying to create space for air to return to their lungs. Neither approach is wrong. Neither approach stops the pain. You'll make a decision and then second-guess it for years, wondering if you dishonored them or held on too tight. The dreams will mess with you in ways you can't prepare for. Sometimes they'll visit you in sleep, vivid and real, and for those few moments, everything is okay again. You'll wake up reaching for them, the loss hitting fresh and brutal, like hearing the news for the first time all over again. Other times, the dreams will be cruel, showing you alternate timelines where they didn't die, where you said the things you needed to say, where you got more time. You'll wake up angry at your own subconscious for torturing you with possibilities that will never exist. The physical world will betray you too. You'll find yourself standing in the grocery store, frozen in the pasta aisle because that was their favorite brand, the one they always insisted on buying. Your hand will reach for it automatically, muscle memory kicking in before your brain catches up to remind you there's no reason to buy it anymore. You'll stand there, holding a box of pasta, feeling ridiculous and devastated in equal measure. Their phone number will still be in your contacts. You'll scroll past it dozens of times, unable to delete it but knowing it leads nowhere. Sometimes, in moments of weakness or fog, you'll almost call it, your thumb hovering over their name before reality crashes back in. Some people do call it. They listen to the voicemail greeting just to hear the voice again, until eventually the number gets reassigned and a stranger answers, wondering why someone is crying on the other end of the line. You'll have to learn to navigate a world that has completely forgotten to accommodate your loss. Bureaucracy doesn't pause for grief. There will be bills to handle, accounts to close, subscriptions to cancel. You'll find yourself on customer service calls, having to explain over and over that the account holder is deceased, each repetition feeling like a small violence against their memory. The representative will offer scripted condolences that sound hollow through the phone line, then immediately ask for a death certificate number. Social media becomes a minefield. Their profile might still be active, frozen in time at the moment they last posted. People who didn't know will continue to tag them in things, post birthday wishes on their wall. You'll have to decide whether to memorialize the account, archive it, or leave it as a strange digital ghost haunting the internet. You'll scroll through their old posts, reading conversations they had, seeing photos they shared, all of it feeling both precious and unbearably painful. The seasons will change, and you'll resent it. How dare spring arrive with its renewal and new growth when they're not here to see it? How can the world just continue its cycle, indifferent to the fact that someone so vital is gone? You'll catch yourself having moments of genuine happiness, then immediately feel guilty for it, as though joy is a betrayal of their memory. The guilt becomes its own kind of prison. You'll police your own emotions, creating rules that no one asked you to follow. You can't listen to music that makes you want to dance. You can't enjoy a beautiful sunset. You can't laugh too loudly at a joke. There's this unspoken belief that grief should look a certain way, that you owe the person you lost a performance of perpetual sorrow. But here's what they don't tell you. Continuing to live isn't disrespectful to the dead. Finding moments of lightness doesn't diminish what they meant to you. Your healing isn't their erasure. In fact, the people who loved us rarely want us to suffer endlessly in their absence. Think about it. If the roles were reversed, would you want someone you love to stop experiencing joy forever because you're gone? Or would you want them to carry forward, to find meaning, to let your memory be a source of warmth rather than only pain? The best way to honor someone isn't to remain frozen in grief. It's to let their influence continue shaping you as you grow. The guilt also appears in unexpected places. You might feel guilty for not grieving enough on certain days, as though there's a quota you're supposed to meet. You'll have a busy day at work where you didn't think about them, and suddenly you're flooded with shame. How could you go 6 hours without actively mourning? What kind of person does that make you? But grief isn't measured in continuous thoughts per day. It's not a test of loyalty. Some days the missing will consume you entirely. Other days it will hum quietly in the background. Both are normal. Both are okay. You might also carry guilt about things you never said or did, the apology you never gave, the visit you kept postponing, the conversation you assumed you'd have later. These regrets can be particularly corrosive because there's no way to resolve them. You can't go back. You can't fix it. All you can do is sit with the discomfort of incompleteness, of a relationship that ended mid-sentence,